Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's Veteran Session C at the CIMVHR Forum. My name is Firdaus Hussaini, and I am the Deputy CEO and VP of Research and Policy at the Center of Excellence on Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder and Related Mental Health Conditions. I'm an honor to moderate today's session. Before I pass it over to our wonderful presenters today, we would like to first address some important acknowledgements. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land from which I am speaking is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin, Huron-Wendat, and Anishinaabe nations. Please take a moment to pause and to reflect on the traditional territories from which you are working today and the Indigenous people who have been stewards of this land for thousands of years. Consider the promise and the challenge of the truth and reconciliation in your community. We have a few housekeeping items to review before the first presentation starts. If you're having issues with your stream quality, click on the click here to switch to the alternative stream button below the video player. This will take you to an alternate stream. If you're having other technical issues, click the help button at the top menu on the page and then send a help request to the technical team. I now have the privilege of introducing our first speaker and presentation. The first presentation is titled Identifying Veteran Cultural Competencies to Enhance Care in the Civilian Health System by Dr. Lena Tamsito. Over to you, Lena.
Thank you very much for spending some time this morning to attend our presentation. Next slide, please. My name is Lena Tamsito. I am declaring that the work that I'm going to be sharing with you today has been supported by Veterans Affairs Canada. Speakers Bureau honoraria and consulting fees are not applicable. Next slide. This program has received financial support from Veterans Affairs Canada in the form of the Veterans Affairs Canada Veteran and Family Wellbeing Fund. This program has also received in-kind support from Cali Unlimited in the form of study recruitment, logistical, and other administrative support. There is no potential for conflict of interest. Next slide, please. And I have no potential bias that needs to be mitigated. Next slide, please. At the end of this presentation, participants will be able to describe challenges experienced by veterans during the transition to the public healthcare system. Participants will be able to provide strategies to support veterans during the transition to the public healthcare system. And participants will be able to provide strategies to support healthcare professionals who work with Canadian veterans during this time. Next slide, please. So for some background information, there are thousands of Canadian Armed Forces veterans who leave service and transition to civilian life each year. As of 2020, there are over 600,000 veterans living in Canada, with the average age of war service veterans being 93 years old, and the average age of Canadian Armed Forces veterans being 58 years old. And all of these people are accessing healthcare services from civilian providers. Learning to navigate a new health system may create additional stress in an already difficult transition. Research has indicated that accessing health providers in the civilian system is a concern for releasing veterans, and it can be difficult for them to access primary healthcare providers. Veterans may experience many health issues, such as chronic pain, arthritis, hearing loss, depression, PTSD, just to name a few, at greater proportions than their civilian counterparts. This means access to quality healthcare services that are sensitive to military and veteran culture is important for veteran health and well-being during this time and over the course of their lives. Emerging research has shown that increased awareness of military culture, that's the culture that veterans are coming from, among healthcare providers positively impacts the quality of healthcare delivery. Next slide, please. The objective of this study was to develop a clinical reference guide to support effective healthcare interactions between veterans and health professionals. Next slide, please. A constructivist approach was taken in this qualitative study that involved data collection through interviews using the critical incident technique. The critical incident technique is a data collection method that encourages participants to describe and reflect on specific situations. In the case of this current study, participants were encouraged to recall, describe, and reflect on both positive and challenging healthcare interactions, in addition to questions aimed specifically to enhancing the quality of healthcare services for veterans. The interview guides were developed by the researchers and based on questions that were previously used in a study that identified cultural competencies when working with military and veteran families. So we recruited participants who were Reg Force veterans and healthcare professionals who had extensive experience providing care to veterans in Canada. All interviews were conducted by telephone between October 2020 and January 2021. Interviews ranged in length from approximately 30 to 60 minutes. Next slide, please. The study originally began in January 2020 with a research ethics application and plans for data collection to begin in March 2020, which obviously changed. The original research design included conducting in-person interviews and focus groups in communities with a high representation of military-connected community members, including Trenton, Ontario, Kingston, Ontario, and Halifax, Nova Scotia. And we decided on those communities because we were hoping to capture the diverse experiences of Canadian veterans and their families. We also had planned to meet community-based physicians within the Calian Primacy Network and conduct focus groups with veterans and their families in those communities. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic and restrictions made to in-person research, the team had to adapt to other methods of data collection. In-person interviews and focus groups were not possible due to research and travel restrictions. The pandemic also significantly impacted our ability to recruit participants, which required changes in recruitment strategies throughout the study. We had individuals who had expressed interest in participating in the study at the beginning of March, and these people were no longer available due to shifts in personal and work demands as a result of the pandemic. Next, please. In total, 8 interviews were completed, including with 5 veterans, 2 physicians, and an occupational therapist. The veteran participants were all male and retired from the CAF. There was 1 male physician and 1 female physician participant. The male physician was a CAF veteran and a family physician, caring predominantly for veterans in the community at the time of the interview. The female physician was a civilian with experience providing care to veterans in the community and was employed within Veterans Affairs Canada. And finally, the OT participant was a female with over 10 years of experience working with veterans in the community. All the participants resided in Central and Eastern Canada. Next, please. Framework analysis was used for analyzing data in the study. This approach to analysis is appropriate when there's little information known about a specific area, with the results of the study being used for a specific purpose. In the case of this study, we wanted to be able to identify specific cultural competencies to better understand health interactions between veterans and healthcare providers. Previous work on the identification and development of military and veteran family cultural competency model served to inform the classifications of for the thematic framework. The image on the slide is the model that illustrates cultural competency for military and veteran families. However, it was a useful reference point for us to use to understand cultural competency during healthcare interactions, and those being awareness, sensitivity, knowledge, skills, and context. Next, please. Cultural awareness includes an acknowledgement that military members and veterans belong to a cultural group that is different from civilian Canadian society. And as a result, their health needs are different from civilians. This quote here is from the OT, who describes her appreciation of the challenges that veterans may face when making that shift from the military world to the civilian world. Next, please. This veteran, however, cautions healthcare providers that when they have that awareness that veterans are different from civilians, that those differences are not lumped together to create stereotypes. Having said that, it really highlights the importance of healthcare providers to take time to reflect on their knowledge and understanding of the similarities and differences between the healthcare experiences of veterans and civilians. Next, please. Sensitivity is defined as a process that occurs within health professionals and represents the affective drive to provide culturally informed care. So it's that desire to do something about the potential differences or inequality that is experienced by veterans when engaging in the civilian healthcare system. This quote here was provided by a physician participant and does a nice job at illustrating what many culturally competent healthcare providers experience, particularly for those without personal experience with the military. Through their work with veterans and families, healthcare providers often describe switch flipping, where they see potential challenges experienced by this population and have this drive to do something about that difference. They either learn a new skill or acquire new knowledge or change their practice. Next, please. Although cultural sensitivity is something that is not observable to others because it happens within a healthcare provider, this veteran's quote illustrates the importance to him that healthcare providers create opportunities to, quote, be invested in understanding who this person is in front of them, end quote. Next, please. Cultural knowledge are the discrete pieces of knowledge about veterans and their health that is acquired either formally, such as by accessing research, or informally, such as speaking with veterans or consulting with colleagues. So, for example, generally there's not a good understanding among healthcare providers as to how Canada's veterans access the healthcare system. This physician participant discusses how it's important for their counterparts to be knowledgeable in things like access to care when working with veterans. Next, please. For veteran participants, they indicated that they would like healthcare providers to have some knowledge about the military, such as the type of military work veterans do, that they may have done over the course of their careers, as a way to provide some context to the illness and injuries that they may be presenting with. This veteran encourages healthcare providers to understand how differences in culture and norms may influence behaviors demonstrated during health interactions. Next, please. Cultural skills are things that healthcare providers do, given their knowledge and understanding of military and veteran culture. For example, given that veterans over the course of their careers are at increased risk for exposure to traumatic events, it's important for healthcare providers to provide care that is trauma-informed and sensitive. This may be unique circumstances that arise in the context of military work, resulting in nuanced impact that it may have on healthcare interactions. For this occupational therapy participant, she understands the importance of trust and rapport building when working with her clients who are veterans. Here she talks about one of the skills that she has developed when working with this specific population. Next, please. And from the perspective of this veteran, trust and the importance of developing it as a healthcare provider is described in this quote. This information is important for healthcare providers to know so that they may find ways to enhance their skills accordingly. Next, please. So given what we were able to identify as veteran cultural competencies, we then went ahead and organized this information into bits of advice. So advice for civilian healthcare providers, and in the next slide that follows, advice for veterans. Building knowledge and understanding, participants recommended that healthcare providers gain some knowledge about the military itself, specifically things like service elements, rank structure, how the Canadian Forces Health Services Group works, as well as awareness of the common health issues that arise in veterans, and also to learn about what Veterans Affairs Canada is and how it supports veterans. Meaningful ways to engage with veterans. There were many recommendations across all the participants for ways that they can engage more meaningfully with veterans. Many involved taking time to understand the veterans' military experience and related health issues. Most participants advised asking the veteran about details of their service, including service element, trade or occupation, deployments, release type, and noticeable exposure or injuries, as well as obtaining and reviewing a copy of the veteran's military health records. Next, please. Veterans also had advice for veterans who were releasing or soon to be releasing as they embark on the journey of accessing the civilian healthcare system. They wanted to highlight, considerations for these members entering the civilian healthcare system. Many participants made recommendations for things for them to keep in mind, such as, being aware that the two healthcare systems are quite different from one another, and for people that are entering the system to be aware of this and be prepared. Preparing for civilian healthcare system, this may include attending scan seminars, and the suggestion to initiate any VAC claims early. Advice for obtaining and interacting with civilian healthcare providers. Veteran participants recommended that for releasing military members to take time to consider their own health needs, as well as those health needs of their families when making decisions as to where they will live. Participants also recommended veterans to familiarize themselves with the health services in the area where they plan to live to ensure that the health needs can be met within their chosen community. Other pieces of advice for veterans that are from veterans include finding a primary health care provider as soon as possible, requesting a copy of their health records, and a reminder to be honest and open with their community-based healthcare provider. Next, please. What we were able to do is to take all this information collected during the interviews, and we created two-page reference guides. One is aimed at healthcare providers working with veterans and their families. Some of the information included in this clinical reference guide included a definition of what a veteran is, things for healthcare providers to consider when meeting with veterans, information on how military service may impact on family well-being. There were suggested questions for healthcare providers when meeting with veterans and or their family members for the first time. It also includes links to non-governmental organizations that may help support their patient or client. And QR codes are also included in this document. The QR codes are government links such as various CAF acronyms, as well as an overview of the Canadian Armed Forces. These clinical reference guides, as just a note, are not yet publicly available. We also created a separate guide for veterans and their family members to support them as they begin accessing the civilian healthcare system. Included in this version of the guide are prompts and cues of things that veterans may want to consider sharing with their civilian healthcare provider, information about Veterans Affairs Canada if they require it, and links to community organizations across Canada who support veterans. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, there are plans to get these clinical reference guides to veterans and their families and healthcare providers. We would like to engage in a process of further content validation to ensure that our findings are reflective of the health experiences of veterans and health professionals who are working with them. And finally, we'd like to be able to determine the utility of clinical reference guides such as this developed out of the project. Next slide. So looking ahead, there are plans to get these clinical reference guides to veterans, their families, and healthcare providers. We would like to engage in a process of further content validation to ensure that our findings are reflective of the health experiences of veterans and health professionals who are working with them. And finally, we would like to be able to determine the utility of reference guides such as this that came out of the project. Next slide, please. I'd like to take a moment to thank the participants of the study, as well as those who are currently and those who have previously served in the CAF and their families. This is who I am again, and where you can reach me if you have any questions. Thank you very much. Next slide. References. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena, for that wonderful presentation. Our next presentation is by Kate Saltier and is titled Sex-Specific Differences in Physical Health and Health Services Use Among Canadian Veterans, a retrospective cohort study. Over to you, Kate.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today for a presentation about sex-specific differences in physical health and health services use amongst Canadian Armed Forces veterans residing in Ontario. This study is part of a research program that was funded by True Patriot Love and the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research through a CIMVHR TPL research initiative. I also hold doctoral research awards from CIHR, Wounded Warriors Canada, and PO International. We have no potential commercial conflicts of interest to report, and any potential biases present in the study were mitigated through the following. The study funders had no role in the study design, data analysis or interpretation, or writing of this presentation, and the results, opinions, and conclusions reported in this presentation are those of the authors alone. We have a few learning objectives to share. At the conclusion of this presentation, we hope that participants will be able to identify whether sex-specific differences in the risk of chronic health conditions exist amongst veterans residing in Ontario, to describe how male and female veterans interact with the provincial healthcare system, and to provide potential reasons for any observed sex-specific differences in healthcare services use. I'm going to start with a bit of background about females in militaries. So females currently represent about 15% of the Canadian Armed Forces and 14% of all Canadian veterans. And this is similar to other national militaries. Females represent about 11% of UK Armed Forces members and veterans in the UK, and about 16% of US Armed Forces active duty members, and about 10% of all veterans in the US. So females have historically fulfilled different roles in militaries than their male counterparts. In Canada, females were initially restricted to roles in administration, medicine, and telecommunications before becoming eligible to serve as vehicle mechanics and drivers. In 1988, female members of the Canadian Armed Forces became eligible to serve in all roles with the exception of submarine service, but this restriction was lifted in 2001 and females became eligible to serve in all roles of the CAF, including combat. This shift didn't occur until a bit later in the US and the UK Armed Forces, so 2016 and 2018 respectively. And so the differences in the timings of which females became eligible to serve in combat roles may mean that there are differences in the sex-specific health outcomes, both within and across national militaries. So most of what we know about female veterans currently comes from US-based samples. And given that contemporary female veterans in Canada likely had similar occupational exposures and experience as their male counterparts, it's possible that the sex-specific differences observed in US samples are attenuated amongst Canadian veterans. So this may limit our ability to extrapolate findings from US studies. As such, we currently have little Canadian evidence available to inform defense and health policy. To help fill this gap, we aim to describe the prevalence of asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, hypertension, myocardial infarction, and rheumatoid arthritis, and to identify rates of medical services use. So we looked specifically at primary care, specialist care, emergency department visits, hospitalizations, and home care visits amongst a cohort of Canadian veterans residing in Ontario using routinely collected administrative healthcare data. We identified a cohort of 31,759 veterans who released from the forces between April 1st, 1990 and December 31st, 2019. And about 14%, or just over 4,500 of these veterans were female. In Canada, healthcare coverage transitions from federal jurisdiction to provincial at the time of release from the forces. And so when an individual is applying for coverage, provincial coverage in Ontario, and they provide evidence of their military service, there's an administrative code that is attached to their provincial healthcare card. So for this study, we obtained an anonymized list of these individuals from the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care and linked this information to the ICS held databases. We used a number of these databases and they were all linked at the individual level. For our first objective, we modeled prevalence risk ratios for each of the 6 conditions outlined here. And our primary exposure variable was biological sex. And this variable came from the OHIP application forms, which specifically asks for sex versus the sociocultural construct of gender. We adjusted our models for age at time of release, region of residence at the local health insurance network or integration network level, neighborhood medium income quintile, rurality of residence, and length of military service. And we used logistic regression and modified Poisson regression models with robust standard errors to estimate the prevalence risk ratios. For our second objective, we had 5 outcome variables there. So each of those different types of healthcare encounters. And again, our primary exposure variable was sex. We adjusted for the same list of covariates that we did for the first objective, but with one modification. So we also adjusted for each of those 6 chronic health outcomes that we modeled in the first objective. And so we modeled prevalence risk ratios, again, using logistic regression and modified Poisson regression models with robust standard errors. And then we restricted to individuals who had at least 1 visit for each particular type of health outcome and modeled rate ratios using Poisson regression. So this table shows just some of the characteristics of the veteran cohort. And notably, we want to point out that females were on average younger at the time of release from the forces than male veterans, and that male veterans were much more likely to have served for 30 or more years than female veterans. This table presents the crude and adjusted prevalence risk ratios of chronic disease. And so if we're looking at the last two columns, you can see that female veterans were much more likely to have rheumatoid arthritis or asthma than their male counterparts, whereas male veterans were more likely to have hypertension, diabetes, or myocardial infarction. And we didn't observe any significant sex-specific difference in the likelihood of COPD in this sample. Here we have the crude and adjusted risks of a healthcare encounter. And so if you look at the second and third columns, you can see that regardless of sex, most veterans had at least one primary care encounter within the first 5 years of release from the forces. And then if we move over to the two columns on the right, females were more likely than males to have each type of health service encounter, with the exception of emergency department visits. And then finally, when we restricted to individuals who had one of the particular visit of interest, we could see that females had higher rates of primary care, specialist care, and emergency department visits than male veterans, and that no significant differences were noted for hospitalizations or home care visits. So just a quick recap of our major findings. In terms of physical health, females had a higher risk of rheumatoid arthritis and asthma compared to male veterans, but a lower risk of diabetes, hypertension, and myocardial infarction. Looking at health services use, most veterans had at least one primary care visit within the first 5 years following release from the forces, and this is regardless of sex. And then with the exception of emergency departments, females were more likely to have each type of visit than males. Finally, looking at rates of utilization, so amongst those veterans who had at least one visit for the particular type of visit of interest, females had higher rates of primary care, specialist care, and emergency department visits. Our study had a number of strengths and limitations. So we used a population-based approach using routinely collected administrative healthcare data, and this was a first for Ontario. Our study also adds much needed international data about the physical health and health services use of female veterans. There are a number of limitations to note. So because of the way the data was collected, up to 15% of our cohort who released between 1990 and 2013 could be veterans of the RCMP versus the Canadian Armed Forces. And it's possible that these individuals have different healthcare needs than veterans of the Canadian Armed Forces. We only looked at OHIP-funded visits, so we potentially underestimated the true rate of health services use. We did not exclude visits for reproductive or genitourinary conditions from our analyses, and it's possible that these conditions may be driving some of the differences we see in terms of sex-specific healthcare service use. And we did not have access to military-related variables that may lie on the causal pathway between military service and health outcomes, such as deployment history. The findings from this study could be used to inform federal and defense program planning and to support resource allocation so that the unique needs of female veterans are met following transition from the forces. And future research examining the stability of these needs over time, so not just restricted to the first 5 years following release, will help inform long-term planning and resource allocation. I've included an additional acknowledgement slide here to show the support and the roles played by ICES and the Ministries of Health and Long-Term Care and the Canadian Institutes of Health Information, as well as a citation to the very recently published study where you can read about this project in more detail. Thank you so much for attending today.
So Kate, we have a few questions from the audience here. One of them being, did the study include reserve veterans or only full-time Army or CAF members?
Thanks, Stephanie. That's a great question. I believe it did include reserve veterans as well. So it would have been anyone when they applied for OHIP upon release from the forces. So as long as they provided some evidence of their military service, they would be included in that veteran cohort.
Thank you for that, Kate. And sorry, my apologies, my internet just cut off, but thank you, Stephanie, for stepping in. Another question was, did you compare this to a non-veteran cohort, and how does sex-specific differences you observed in the risk of chronic conditions compare to the Canadian general population?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So if you have the time and you're able to navigate to the recently published study, we do have in the supplemental data, we did a quick comparison to the Ontario general population using 2016 data from the Canadian Chronic Disease Surveillance System. So not two different data sources, but despite that, we did see similar patterns in the general population compared to what we saw in our veteran cohort. So namely that female civilians also had higher rates of asthma and rheumatoid arthritis compared to male civilians, while males had higher rates of diabetes, hypertension, and myocardial infarction. And then the slight difference in the civilian sample that we looked at was that males also did have slightly higher rates of COPD, whereas in the veteran cohort, there were no statistically significant differences there.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question from the audience was, there's been so much focus on comparing women and men. Would it be worthwhile just to focus on the needs of women? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, another great question. And I think that's what this research program is hoping to do in part. So we know it's very well documented that the specific needs of female veterans have been understudied compared to male veterans. So our hope with this particular study was to first sort of tease out whether those differences do appear to exist within a Canadian veteran population. And then from there to build a further research program where we eventually hopefully are working directly with female veterans kind of more closely than just through the administrative data to identify those needs and how those needs can best be met.
Okay. How much of an impact do you think including healthcare visits for reproductive care had on the observed differences in healthcare seeking between male and female veterans?
Okay, thanks. That's a tough one. We specifically didn't remove those visits because we were primarily interested in just describing how veterans interact with the provincial healthcare system within those first 5 years of reintegrating into civilian life. So that said, given that a substantial number of the female veterans in our cohort were of typical childbearing age, it's possible, certainly, that they're driving some of those rates of healthcare service utilization. I think probably, again, this is without having really looked at the data, I think it's likely that there may be driving use of certain services more so than others. So in my mind, hospitalizations due to childbirth may be one that's affected more so than perhaps emergency department visits or even specialist care.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question from the audience is that there's been a couple of studies using life after service survey data on male and female differences in healthcare use and chronic conditions. How do these findings compare to that?
Yeah, so I think the findings were similar. I believe when we kind of looked back to the life after service studies, one of the, I guess, limitations of those studies was that because of the smaller sample size, the data was less granular, and they weren't able to quite break down by conditions to the extent that we were using the population level administrative healthcare data. But I think, if I'm recalling correctly, that they seem to be jiving fairly well, despite coming from different data sources, and the life after service studies being national versus provincial.
Wonderful, thank you, Kate. It's always good to know when replication can happen across studies, but Yeah, a lot of excitement for this presentation, and thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you.
We'll go to a break for 5 minutes, and Kate shared her information. If any additional questions come up, reach out to us or Kate. Thank you all. Welcome back, everyone, and I hope you all had a nice health break. Our next presentation is by Ashley Williams and is titled Veterans Transition from the Canadian Forces Health Services to Provincial Primary Care During Transition to Civilian Life. Over to you, Ashley.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ashley Williams. I'm a PhD candidate at Queen's University, and I'm here to speak to you today about our project titled Veterans Transition from the Canadian Forces Health Services to Provincial Primary Care During Transition to Civilian Life. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize my co-authors, Drs. Heidi Cram, Catherine Donnelly, David Pedler, and Brent Wolfram. And before we dive in, I'd like to also take a moment to acknowledge the research participants for this project, as well as my PhD committee members who are also the co-authors on this project. And I'd also like to acknowledge scholarship funding through Wounded Warriors Canada, CIMVHR, the Government of Ontario, and Queen's University. I have no commercial interest to disclose other than the scholarship support mentioned on the previous page, and no commercial support to disclose, and no potential bias to mitigate. And by the end of the presentation, I hope that you'll be able to describe the challenges associated with the transition from Canadian Forces Health Services to provincial and territorial primary care, and also identify recommendations to improve health service transition associated with military to civilian transition. So while Canadian Armed Forces members are in service, they access the Canadian Forces Health Services, which is a federally operated health system that's designed specifically for the military and requires very little navigation on the part of the military member. And after release, veterans access civilian public health services or the civilian public health system, which is operated by provinces and territories. And this includes primary care, which is really the first point of contact in the civilian health system and facilitates access to other parts of the civilian health system like specialist care. And while some research suggests that the transition between these two health systems can be challenging, there's no studies that have specifically examined veterans' experience with this aspect of the military to civilian transition, particularly around primary care access after release. And this is really important to understand because veterans experience some health conditions at greater proportions than the Canadian general population. So it's really important to understand how they access care during the transition process. So in order to address this gap, we asked the research question, how do Canadian veterans experience the transition from Canadian Forces Health Services to provincial primary care during military to civilian transition, or MCT? And we used a qualitative phenomenological approach to really address this research question and get at the essence of that transition experience for veterans. We recruited a purposive sample of regular force veterans who had released within the last 6 months to 3 years, who had sought primary care since their release. And we looked for a range of service elements, ranks, and release types to really get a sense of what the experience was broadly. And our recruitment was primarily through social media and word of mouth. And for our data collection, we conducted individual in-depth interviews, and these were done in person prior to the start of the pandemic, as well as by phone between December 2019 and August of 2020. And these interviews were audio recorded and transcribed to prepare for data analysis. And our data analysis involved phenomenological data analysis to really look at what are the core elements of the experience of leaving the Canadian Forces Health Services and transitioning to civilian primary care. So ultimately, we were able to interview 16 veterans, and there was an average of 20 years old at enlistment and 43 years at release, with an average of 23 and a half years of service. And 13 participants had been able to find a primary care provider at the time of the interview. We had a good mix of service elements, but medical releases, female veterans, and officer ranks were overrepresented compared to life after service survey samples. So through our analysis, we identified 3 themes that really encompassed this health service transition experience among veterans, among our participants. And I'd like to go through each theme in turn. So the first theme is leaving the mothership, acclimating to a new system. And the first feature within this theme is really around shifting between systems. And there was really a range of responses to the change that veterans experienced when they left the Canadian Forces Health Services. Some were relatively unfazed by the change, while others expressed being shocked at the difference they saw when they left the military. And that shock was particularly announced among participants who'd had very little exposure to the civilian health system before leaving service. And even among those who did have some idea of what to expect, they felt there was really some adjustment required to kind of get used to that new system. And participant 10 on the slide here really speaks to that. They say, having spent 21 years in a system where you're put at the front of the line, that kind of becomes your norm. It still takes a bit of an adjustment to realize that, instead of being 1 in 60,000, now you're one of 35 million. And the second feature of this first theme is really around getting set up in a new system. So once you've kind of overcome that initial shift, figuring out how that system works. And this really involved negotiating administrative processes like getting a new health card, organizing extended health benefits, and also just sort of learning how the new system works. So that could be figuring out how to get a family doctor, how to get prescriptions filled, and these sort of logistical things that you really didn't have to think about when you were in the military. And participant 9 speaks to this when they say, I had to ask my wife, how do I make a doctor's appointment? I didn't have to do that for 14 years. I just go and everything will be done for me. That was one of the challenging things, was just doing all that, I guess just adding the logistical work again for yourself. And the other aspect of getting set up in a new system was searching for a primary care provider. And some participants were able to find a family doctor fairly early, some even before they released. But for those who weren't able to find a family doctor, they had a gap in between when they released and when they were able to become attached to a new primary care provider on the civilian side. And that gap is really the subject of the next theme, which is lost in outer space, the gap between Canadian Forces Health Services and provincial territorial primary care. And the first feature within this theme is the nervous position of being unattached to a primary care provider. And so participants who had this gap where they didn't have a regular primary care provider really felt like they were not really very well supported medically, and were unsure of how they would go about finding care if they were in need of it. So participant 6 speaks to this when they say, I'm in a nervous position right now. I don't feel supported or taken care of because I don't even have that point of contact. I wish I did. And the second feature within this theme is the onerous job of accessing health services without a regular primary care provider. And within this feature, participants really talked about how it was really challenging to be able to get the care they needed for reasonably simple things when they didn't have a regular primary care provider. And they talked about going to walk-in clinics or going to the emergency room for things that weren't really an emergency, just to get something simple like a prescription filled, for example. And participant 9 speaks to this when they say, in the walk-in clinic, the lines, you have to get there at like 6 in the morning or you won't get in. You had to take these numbers and stand in line and wait all day just to get a prescription filled. And this was particularly challenging for people who had multiple ongoing health issues that required regular contact with a primary care provider. So they were having to go and do these things regularly. And then the last feature of this theme is the sense of abandonment that can result when participants weren't really feeling very well supported. So there was this sense that, there wasn't a lot of support to help them find a primary care provider, whether that was through Canadian Armed Forces or the provincial system. And that left them feeling like they weren't really cared about or like they were being abandoned. So these 2 participants speak to this. So the first one says, you very much get the feeling like you're just sent out to pasture and wished good luck. And then another participant said, 30 plus years, you'd think that accounts for something. And that brings us to the final theme, which is walk you across the bridge, bridging the gap. And so this theme is all about how we can go about smoothing that transition for veterans as they leave service and are going between these 2 health systems. And veterans indicated that improving the health service transition and supporting veterans in getting a primary care provider would really help address this gap and would have really positive implications for veterans as they move forward in their transition. And the 2 participants here speak to this. And the first one says, I think that if the medical shit can become easier, then everything else becomes easier. And then the second participant says, I think they would feel really important, not that they were being sent to the wayside. I think it's good for a lot of our veterans. And some of the most common suggestions for improving this gap was to eliminate the sharp cutoff of services from the Canadian Forces Health Services after the release date by extending access to the Canadian Forces Health Services until the veteran's able to find a primary care provider. So if we kind of tie everything together, the most sort of salient piece that came out of our analysis was really that while not all participants had difficulty finding a primary care provider, when there was a gap and the person had ongoing health issues, the transition between health systems was really challenging. So that combination of having a gap and having health conditions that need regular attention created a problem. And overall, the experiences that we heard from our participants align with other MCT literature that suggests there may be challenges in the health service transition. So I think we need more research to really understand this aspect of MCT. And if we think about what can be done right now in terms of making some changes now to help smoothen this transition for veterans, in terms of Canadian Armed Forces, Department of National Defence, and Veterans Affairs Canada, Increasing focus on the health service transition during the release process could be helpful. In particular, formalizing supports to help veterans attach to a primary care provider shortly, either before or shortly after they leave service, would be helpful. And addressing that abrupt cutoff of health services at the release date, either by, extending access to the Canadian Forces Health Services or helping veterans attach to a primary care provider sooner, would be helpful. And if we think about provincial primary care, providers can really help by learning more about military culture and the health risks associated with military service, so that they're better positioned to provide care for veterans. And also, screening for military service would be very helpful, and adding veteran status to the electronic medical record would very much help, particularly with research efforts in the future. And here are the references. And I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any comments or questions at this time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentation, Ashley. Very informative. We've heard a lot about the difficulties of transition, and I know you just touched on it at the end there, but could you elaborate a bit more on the recommendations for improving access to primary care, both for CAF and for the provinces?
Yeah, so I think from the CAF side, certainly the most common suggestion was to extend access to the Canadian Forces Health Services until veterans are able to secure a family doctor on the civilian side. I think some of the other things as well are sort of around educating veterans about the differences they're going to see on the civilian side before they get there. Again, some people had a pretty good idea of what they were going to be facing just through family members, but having that educational piece, I think, would be helpful as well. And a lot of participants talked about attaching that to the SCAN seminars, and even having recently released veterans come in and talk about that experience. So I think those are kind of some of the things on the CAF side. And I think on the provincial side, there were a lot of issues that came up around health cards. So, for example, here in Ontario, you can't get on Healthcare Connect, which is sort of the provincial waiting list to get a family doctor, unless you have an OHIP card, which you often can't get until after the day of release, right? You have to actually be officially released. So that really stymies the ability for veterans to be proactive in looking for a family doctor on the civilian side. And that's one of the things that we hear all the time, right, is being proactive, and there's sort of this big barrier there that prevents them from being proactive. So I think maybe lifting some of those requirements to allow veterans to get on those lists earlier would be really helpful. I also think that saving space on wait lists for veterans could also be helpful, whether that's done through the provincial wait lists or whether that's done through individual clinics. So those are some of the extra pieces that came up that I didn't really get to put on the slides.
Thank you for that additional detail. And it's important to be proactive and address the barriers as you've identified. There's a question that asked, is the marital status increase access to primary care? Or did that come up?
That's a great question. So it did come up. There were some veterans who indicated that they had been taken on by their family's provider. So that certainly does happen. But I also had the opposite, right, where the family member's family doctor had no room and couldn't take them. So it's kind of a hit and miss sort of thing. But certainly for those who did find a primary care provider reasonably early on, it was often through social networks, whether that was family or they happened to know a physician, or sometimes their medical officer knew a family physician in the area that was taking patients or that did them a favor. So oftentimes that was sort of where that connection came in.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ashley, for your presentation and addressing some of the questions.
Thank you.
Our next presentation is by Zachary Gibson and is titled Beyond Network Effectiveness, the Value of Operational Metrics and Evaluation. Over to you, Zach.
Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure today to have the opportunity to share with you some of my and my research team's work on operational metrics in the evaluation of care team systems. My name is Zachary Gibson, and I'm a doctoral candidate in the Technology and Social Behavior program at Northwestern University School of Communication. The project I'll be speaking about today was funded by a grant from the U.S. Army Research Office. In terms of support, this program has received in-kind support from the Institute for Veterans and Military Families in the forms of data access and logistical support. To mitigate potential bias resulting from this support, we took several steps. The IVMF team members provided data to the broader team in the format in which they receive it from their technology vendor. Only non-IVMF team members handled data cleaning, and non-IVMF team members led and conducted the analysis, but with input from IVMF team members. Now let's get started. This talk has 4 major learning objectives. At the end, we hope you'll be able to discuss integrative care systems for veterans, define system effectiveness, efficiency, and accuracy, describe different ways to measure these constructs, and explain why system evaluation should include efficiency and accuracy measures. With our learning objectives clarified, let's explore some relevant context and what prior research has done. Currently in the United States, there are nearly 19 million veterans and counting. Alongside that, there is growing public interest to improve benefits for veterans. There's also significant funder and governmental interest in social determinants of health, including the World Health Organization, the CDC, the Drug Administration, and various for-profit and nonprofit funders. Following their calls, we have directed our attention to one such program that seeks to address veteran care in the U.S. America Serves is the country's first coordinated system of public, private, and nonprofit organizations working together to serve veterans, transitioning service members, and their families. Now, traditional care systems come with the intent of drawing diverse providers together, but they require that each provider refer directly to other providers, such as food to health or education to financial assistance. This peer-to-peer model is problematic because it inherently creates gaps. It's unrealistic to expect every provider to know every other provider's services in their community, and these problems expand when you consider issues like eligibility requirements, logistical issues, or concurrent needs. The America Serves approach overcomes this by placing a coordination center at the middle. The coordination center manages intake and referral of all clients, allowing the providers to focus on providing. Moreover, this centralizes knowledge of services, requirements, eligibility, documentation, and so on in one organization. In turn, this helps reduce care gaps in the area. Now, in terms of our objectives, we've covered a bit about typical integrative care systems and what distinguishes America Serves model. But how do we measure the performance or the success of these networks? Traditional measures of performance consider the outputs or outcomes of the network. In public administration, Torini et al. Describe network effectiveness as the benefits produced by the network that accrue to more than just single members. We propose adding measures of process performance to this framework, specifically efficiency and accuracy. Now, network efficiency has been measured in many contexts, but it generally means to optimize some type of cost. These costs may be financial, time, effort, logistics, or anything else that must be put into the work of care. For our study, though, we'll focus on time. Now, network accuracy, although much less studied than efficiency, typically describes the extent to which a person's perception matches reality. In the context of care systems, we define accuracy as whether the first referral connected a client with care. As such, more attempts suggest an inaccurate view of the network, whether in terms of services, requirements, capacity, or other factors. We also consider network effectiveness in our study, as research has shown the importance of it in producing positive feedback loops, so-called virtuous cycles. As a result, there are already several measures of effectiveness in care, such as case closure, the timeliness of case closure, client satisfaction, and readmission. However, in our study, we focus on case closure as effectiveness. With that, we've offered some definitions for system effectiveness, efficiency, and accuracy, and ways they can and have been measured. And that summarizes our brief lit review. So now I'll talk a bit about our study and findings. Our study draws on data from 11 America Serves networks spread across the central and eastern US. Within each network, we pulled data on all service requests in the 30-day window before their respective states' response to COVID. In doing this, we hoped we would capture more stable activity patterns. As I've mentioned, we focused on 3 measures of performance aggregated to the network level. These are efficiency, or how many days it took to accept the referral, accuracy, or the % of referrals accepted by the first provider, and effectiveness, or the % of cases resolved. Now, to start off our analysis, we first looked at some basic statistical tests to check for significant variation across the networks. Our test showed significant variation for all 3 performance metrics, and in particular, we found that accuracy ranged from 67% to 100%, effectiveness from 54 to 94%, and efficiency from 1 day to 9 days to accept a referral. So overall, we have pretty wide bands for performance. The question then is whether there are groups of networks that perform similarly. That is, are there profiles of network performance? To answer that question, we performed a cluster analysis on our networks. And for anyone unfamiliar, cluster analysis is a way of looking for groups with common characteristics in data. In this case, we're looking for groups of networks. Our analysis identified 3 clusters or groups with similar performance profiles. And so what this figure shows is our different performance metrics, where each network falls along those metrics, and to which group they belong. The closer networks are to the corner of the plot, the better their overall performance. So the first cluster, colored in black, performed highly on effectiveness and accuracy, but moderately to poorly on efficiency. The second cluster in green performed moderately on all 3 metrics. And the third cluster, colored in pink, performs highly on all 3. However, we do hedge on calling these groups high or low performers, however, without first understanding why their performance appears the way it does. In other words, why the differences in performance. Our hypothesis was that something about the services themselves might affect performance. This logic surfaces from the fact that care systems combine sectors where definitions and measures of success differ. Moreover, the various sectors operate quite differently. Providing food from a food bank differs from finding shelter for homeless individuals, which differs still from providing long-term physical or mental health care. Therefore, since we have 15 service categories represented in our data, we engaged in another cluster analysis to simplify our exploration of the performance differences. By clustering the different services together, we can dig deeper into where the differences in networks performance emerge without painting too complex a picture. Our clustering of the services revealed results similar to those of our network clustering. As services grouped together based on their performance tendencies and the number of requests each had. The first, in green, captures daily needs like clothing, food, health, and transportation. These are typically services that are more easily satisfied and involve the transfer of tangible goods like food or clothes, or simpler services like arranging a ride. The second, in yellow, describes economic needs such as benefits navigation, employment, and income support. These include services that help clients identify how and where to use their benefits, and services that help them secure both short and long-term income. The third cluster, in blue, describes more supportive kinds of services such as legal aid, mental health, and money management. These services are more circumstantial and help clients maintain their autonomy. The last, in pink, describes more long-term needs, such as education and family support. These include entrance into colleges and certification programs, and ongoing support like home visitation. Notably, there appears to be a progression from green to yellow to blue to pink in terms of their typical performance, which may suggest some quantifiable spectrum of complexity across these different services, though we don't dive deeper into that here. Of course, our goal is not to explore the services in isolation, but in relation to the networks. So first, we consider the distribution of requests across our 3 networks. What immediately stands out is how different N3's distribution is from N1 and N2. N3 has by far the most requests for daily needs and the least requests for economic needs, with daily needs being notably easier to satisfy. N1 and N2, however, are relatively similar. N1 has slightly more requests for daily and support needs and slightly fewer from economic needs than N2. At face value, this might suggest that N3's performance is a product of its service demand. Yet, it's valuable to take a deeper look at the network's performances across the services, especially since the demand for services isn't equal across networks. By looking at how the different network clusters perform across services, we can identify weak and strong points. To start, N1 networks tend to struggle with efficiency, but are the most effectiveness in services addressing support and long-term needs, and the most accurate on services addressing daily needs. For example, one of our East Coast networks tends to get their food and clothing requests resolved on the first try, and always finds an answer for people seeking help with money management education. However, it may take a week or longer before the client connects with care. N2 networks, by contrast, are moderately efficient, being the most efficient on supportive services, but they tend to struggle with accuracy and effectiveness across other service categories. One of our central networks, for instance, may take several tries to connect a client with any of the services, but will get them connected within a few days. Unfortunately, despite the network's faster connections, many of their clients go with their needs unresolved. Finally, N3 networks generally show high overall performance, except on supportive services, in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. One of our Northeastern networks can connect clients to services on the first try in a day or two, and will typically see that client's need resolved. The only exception is when the client is seeking legal aid. Thus, overall, we see that the picture of network performance is not an easy one. N3 does tend to perform highly across the board, but we don't know the extent to which this is a result of the network emphasizing easier services or genuinely higher demand for easier services. Similarly, N1 tends to outperform N2 despite their similar service demands, but we don't know whether that emerges from capacity issues, better referral processes, or other explanations. What the picture does show, however, is that case resolution isn't the only important component. Both N1 and N3 have their services where they are most accurate or most efficient, and this information can help identify best practices for integrative systems of care. Now, that was a lot of information, that covers our results, but I hope you now feel able to explain why system evaluation should include efficiency and accuracy. Now, that was a lot of information, and it's time for me to wrap up. In terms of key takeaways, I hope you'll agree with me now that network performance is a complex construct, and measuring only one piece provides an incomplete picture. By measuring and understanding the processes of systems of care, their functioning and ultimately their outcomes can improve. On that note, efficiency and accuracy are valuable measures of process and systems of care. The goal of these systems is to provide quick, successful connections, and that's what these measures capture. Finally, not all networks or geographies are equal. Different locales need different services, and this will be reflected in networks' performance. Comparing networks directly against one another without considering the services they address may result in unfair judgments of their performance. When you consider metrics, particularly accuracy and efficiency, it's important to think about the types of services provided. Overall, case resolution is an important metric, but looking at just case resolution can miss the specific areas where networks flourish or need improvement. In terms of our 4 learning objectives here, this talk introduced both decentralized and centralized forms of care systems. It also highlighted the variety of services present in those systems and the challenges of coordinating care. This talk provided conceptual definitions for effectiveness, efficiency, and accuracy in the context of integrative care. It also described several ways to measure these constructs and the way we measured them in our study. Finally, it hopefully explained why measuring process should be included in evaluations. It's a classic model, but it holds true that processes translate inputs to outputs, and better processes produce better outputs. Here are the references for this talk, and thank you again for letting me share a little bit about our work with you all. Feel free to contact me at zgibson@u.northwestern.edu if you have any questions we don't get to during the Q&A. Thank you again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zachary, for that informative presentation.
Thank you.
We know evaluation is key. Could you offer some concrete steps organizations or networks can take to evaluate process?
Sure. So obviously, I think it starts with what you already have. So consider what are the goals of either your organization or of your network. What is the service that you're trying to provide or the services that you're trying to provide? And start looking at how you already have data available there and sort of identify where you already are and where you're trying to get, and then find out where the gaps are in your process. Once you have those gaps in process identified, start thinking more concretely about what the different data are that you need in order to supply those evaluations. And in the end, I think the more transparent these processes are, the more comfortable different veterans and military individuals are with accessing care. They gain more trust as they can see those things unfolding rather than just this opaque care process.
So yeah, transparency is key in building that authentic relationship with veterans and their families. We had a question that asks, how could this apply to solutions to patient access to healthcare, which we know is a growing problem everywhere? Can you speak to that a bit?
Sure. So this isn't part of this study specifically, but a more recent study that I did as part of my dissertation. One of the things that I found there, so there's several barriers, right? There's barriers in terms of the actual access of care, and then there's barriers in terms of information. And so in terms of actual access to care, this type of network approach can be really helpful. And so what America Serves has done is that these different providers that are part of their networks aren't just private providers, aren't just public providers. It's the VA, it's private organizations in the network, it's nonprofit organizations in the community that are all linked together by this common information technology that allows them to maintain awareness of the different resources that are in their network or in their geography, I should say, and access sort of a one-stop shop for veterans and military affiliated individuals. So if a veteran comes in for a healthcare visit, they can be referred directly through that technology to any of the other services that are available in America Serves. They can end up from healthcare to income assistance or to legal aid or to a food bank or to wherever. And so I think these types of approaches that foster a more communal approach to care can help break down those barriers in access by making providers more aware of the services that are available in their area. In terms of informational barriers, I think it's really just giving patients or clients access to what information is being documented on them. So letting them be part of their own care process rather than just a bunch of providers talking to one another while the client just simply sits and waits. I think the extent to which they can see that this progress is happening, the more confident they feel that they're moving toward care and aren't just lost in the wind.
Wonderful, thank you, Zachary. And I think there's another presentation for you once you have some of that information. Yeah. Could you speak to what kinds of data are necessary to evaluate process care networks?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about two here, right? We talk about efficiency and accuracy. And in the context of our study, efficiency is just essentially responsiveness of the providers. How quickly are clients and veterans getting to care? Whereas accuracy is more a measure internally that says how many tries did it take to get there? But there are other things that we might consider as well, right? We might consider measures of accountability, things that sort of represent how often providers are accepting referrals, how well they're taking in clients, measures of capacity or ways for providers in the community to signal, hey, I can take on more clients at this time, or no, I can't take on more clients. We need to find additional providers. But I think, again, it gets to what I was saying to the first question. It ultimately depends on what the goals of either the organization or the network are, and thinking about the types of data that they need to trace and to represent those goals throughout their process. And so it'll vary a bit by process, but I think timeliness and accuracy are two really strong ones, as well as anything that can demonstrate capacity of the network. So although this may be varies by organization. Like a food bank can't necessarily just publicize, we have this much food, or a housing organization can't necessarily say, we have this many units available. They can signal through something as simple as a toggle saying this program has the capacity to take more people in, or this program doesn't. And so that can help sort of direct the traffic of referrals in the network to make sure people are accessing care more quickly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zachary. Some of the few additional questions that we didn't get to, but as Zachary mentioned, his email was there, and we'll share that with you as well after the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our fifth presentation is by Dr. Don Richardson and is titled Well-Being of Canadian Veterans During the COVID-19 Pandemic, Cross-Sectional Results from the COVID-19 Veterans Well-Being Study. Over to you, Don.
Hi, my name is Don Richardson, and I am the Medical Director of St. Joseph Operational Stress Injury Clinic in London, and I am also the Scientific Director of the Macdonald Franklin OSI Research Center. And today I'm going to talk about research we're doing, examining well-being of Canadian veterans during the current pandemic. I do not have anything to disclose, and this type of research is not done alone. So we have a large team of researchers and also external collaborators. And as part of this initiative, we also have veteran and spouse representation. So the learning objectives, at the end of this presentation, attendees will be able to list the rates of PTSD, major depressive disorder, suicidal ideation in veterans during the COVID pandemic, identify the mental health impact of COVID exposure during the pandemic, and describe the clinical implications of transitioning to virtual care. So why is this type of research important? Well, the impact of the current pandemic on Canadian veterans is generally unknown. And we also, from research that was done on the general Canadian population, about 40% reported worse mental health since the pandemic, and also about 20% reported alcohol consumption. So we're also interested in the specific impact this might also have on veterans. Veterans also represent an at-risk population. Veterans are more likely to have mental health conditions compared to the general population. Research has shown that Canadian Armed Forces veterans, approximately 21, meet the criteria for probable PTSD and about 14% for depression. We also know that veterans have increased isolation. Veterans experience heightened risk of loneliness, which with the pandemic might be exacerbated. And we also know that with the pandemic, there's been significant changes to the delivery of healthcare. A lot of the healthcare has transitioned to what would be virtual or to telehealth, and it's important to understand the impact this might have on veterans. So our objective is to capture the impact of the COVID pandemic on the well-being of veterans and also on their spouses. And the second objective is to identify trajectories of mental health functioning over time. In terms of methodology, our study design, this is a prospective longitudinal online survey that is, and we are currently still gathering data. Baseline collection was between July 2020 to February 1st, 2021. It has follow-ups every 3 months and will continue for 18 months. Participants, it was open to all Canadian veterans and spouses of Canadian veterans, and recruitment was done through professional networks, press release and media events, veteran community and advocacy groups, and also through social media. In terms of the domains of assessments, I'm going to list the ones I'm going to focus on this research. We captured demographics, vocation, the type of work people were doing, and location in Canada. mental health symptoms, PTSD, using the PTSD checklist, depression, using the PHQ-9, anxiety, using the GAD-7, and alcohol use using the audit. We also assess for loneliness and social isolation using the UCLA loneliness scale. And then for COVID-related fears, we use the adapted crisis scale, which examines COVID exposure, COVID worry, and life changes due to the pandemic. And then we have items related to healthcare access. So in terms of baseline results, our characteristics of the sample, we were able to recruit 1,139 veterans. And here I'm focusing only on the veteran population for this presentation. Mean age of 55, over almost 76% were males, 21.7% were females. Ethnicity, most were white, followed by Aboriginal and Blacks and Hispanics. Marital status, most were married or living common law, and there was an equal spread among large cities, small cities, and rural area. In terms of most were living with their spouse, and only 16.6% were living alone. When we look at kind of demographics compared to where we know veterans are living, we had good representation across all Canadian provinces. So in terms of the results, when we look first at COVID-related concerns, about 72.5% were concerned about their own health, 73% with concerns regarding accessing essential goods, 62% had concerns regarding to the stability of their living situation, and about 11% described concerns with violence at home. In terms of loneliness, about almost 22% felt lonely often or always, about 24% felt lonely some of the time, and about 30% reported that this was different from how they felt pre-pandemic. When we look at the general mental health, similar to what was also seen in the general population, about 56% reported that their overall mental health was worse, about 30% indicated that there was no change, and very little, about 4% indicated that their mental health was better. Of interest, this is from the veterans' perspective, 39% endorsed or indicated that they felt that their mental health of their spouses had also worsened. When we look at just general mental health in this cross-sectional kind of at baseline, and this is looking at self-reported frequency of probable PTSD, major depressive disorder, alcohol use disorder, and suicidal ideation, we found that about 34% met the criteria for probable PTSD, 36% for major depressive disorder, 27% for generalized anxiety disorder, about 13% for alcohol use disorder, and of significance, about 22% endorsed having suicidal ideations at least of several days or greater. And about 39% to 53% attributed their symptoms of regarding PTSD, depression, anxiety as either directly related or exacerbated by the pandemic. When we look at in terms of other mental health, we also looked at being exposed to COVID. Did that have an impact? So comparing those who were exposed to COVID compared to those who were not, those who were exposed to COVID had higher rates of depression, higher anxiety symptoms, also had higher PTSD symptoms. And the alcohol, though, was not significantly related. And then with regards to, in terms of loneliness, higher rates of loneliness, which with restrictions, if you were exposed, probably explains part of that. When we look in terms of correlation between mental health variables and loneliness, this is probably not surprising, but loneliness was correlated with depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and was also correlated with alcohol use severity. When we examined also access to care, about 48% indicated they had difficulty accessing care, and about 27% reported no difficulty. The most common was accessing care through their family doctor or seeing their dentist and specialty care. Most concerns were related to physical health or a combination of physical and mental health, and those who were unable to access care for mental health were more distressed than those who were unable to access care due to physical health concerns. This is also something that is of interest and also has some potential clinical implications in terms of telepsychiatry. Approximately 18% started using telepsychiatry since the pandemic. When we looked at in terms of what its acceptability, about 73% indicated that they would recommend telepsychiatry to a friend, and about 73% indicated that they would choose telepsychiatry if it was available post-pandemic. So these type of results also demonstrates how acceptable telepsychiatry or telehealth was, but also has potential implications post-pandemic. So in terms of the general discussions and conclusions from this study, this is the first national longitudinal survey examining the mental health and general well-being of veterans in Canadian veterans during the pandemic. Our preliminary kind of baseline results showed that most veterans, about 56%, reported worsening of mental health functioning. A significant proportion, about 39 to 53%, attributed their mental health symptoms as being related or exacerbated by the pandemic. Mental health symptoms severity, here it's depression, anxiety, PTSD, and alcohol, and loneliness was associated with exposure to COVID. And loneliness, not surprisingly, was also associated with mental health symptom severity. Of note from this study is the positive response to telehealth, and which has important clinical implications and also program development implications post-pandemic. Now, this type of study has many limitations. It is a self-reported study, and that people could register online. Also, individuals that did not have good access to internet or did not have ability to use the internet were unfortunately excluded because you needed internet access to do this survey. So therefore, it's not representative of all Canadian veterans. And keeping in mind this, today I'm presenting baseline data, and data collection is currently ongoing. We also cannot rule out that individuals who have more severe symptoms might be more likely to fill out surveys. And then in terms of next step, we want to examine the data from veteran spouses, and we also want to look at the relationship between different domains and more importantly, identify risk factors. These are some references that was used for this report and study. And so thank you for your attention, and please don't hesitate to contact me on my email if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that informative presentation, Don. This data and information is very timely and needed. I'm sure everyone will be keeping a close eye as you continue to follow folks across the pandemic time. So I see your results did show a general preference for virtual care, and we know that we're operating still in a mostly virtual world. Do you foresee any clinical implications for this preference for virtual care?
Yeah, thank you for this. I think it's such an important question because there was a general preference for virtual care even post-pandemic, and so my guess it'll be a challenge for us to ever go back to our previous new normal. I would expect that kind of the implications, both myself as a clinician, but also for program. How can we enhance virtual care to veterans in order to help them access care? And also, as I mentioned, to participate in the study, you had to have had good internet access. So what we don't know is, of those individuals who do not have access to maybe high-speed internet, how do we ensure that they are not put at a disadvantage with regards to accessing care?
Thanks for that, Don. I know you have a few follow-up studies. There was a question from the audience that asked about drop-off rate for the study. Do you have any information about that, or are you still analyzing that?
Yeah, we do have that. We do have that data that I can provide to that individual if they email me. The drop-off has been, I don't have the exact rates, but have been pretty good in terms of being able to continue to access the survey. But as you can imagine, for an 18-month survey, we do provide reminders, but we do get kind of the general kind of drop-offs, but I can provide that information.
Absolutely, I will share that person's information with you, Don. We can share that, but of course, any study that's that long will have drop-offs. Another piece that you presented on, your results show that 50% or close to 50% had difficulty accessing healthcare. And with loosening of restrictions, do you anticipate improvements in healthcare access from veterans?
Yeah, I would expect that because it's a longitudinal survey, we're able to match changes with regards to both second, third, or fourth wave, and even differences between provinces. So I would anticipate, and I'm actually interested in looking to see if access to care has changed, especially as at the beginning, this is kind of our baseline data. This is when individuals probably had a lot of problems accessing care, but over time, a lot of family physicians and opening up of virtual care, maybe access to care had improved considerably. And then I'm also interested to see how a kind of preference has changed over time. So maybe accessing virtual care might have been very supportive at the beginning, but maybe over time people are wanting to go back to in-person. And as you can see from some of the media attention is encouraging physicians and other clinicians to go back to in-person care in a safe manner.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Don. And as I mentioned, it's very timely information. I'm sure we'll all keep a close eye on the results as they come out. And again, thank you so much for your presentation.
Okay.
We'll now be going to a bit of a health break. So we will reconvene the group at 12:30. See everyone then. Welcome back, everyone. We hope you all had a nice break. Our next presentation is by Hélène Lecelaire and is titled Life in the Shadow of the Uniform, the Transition Experience of Canadian Military Members Released within OSI. Over to you, Hélène.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Hélène Lecelaire, doctorante en service social à l'Université d'Ottawa et ancienne combattante des Forces armées canadiennes. Aujourd'hui, je suis ici pour vous présenter mon projet de recherche qui s'intitule « La vie dans l'ombre de l'uniforme, l'expérience de transition identitaire chez les militaires canadiens libérés en raison d'une blessure de stress opérationnel ». Mon projet de recherche n'a aucune relation avec des intérêts commerciaux et je n'ai jamais reçu non plus de soutien commercial où il n'y a aucune présence de conflit d'intérêts potentiel. L'objectif d'apprentissage de la présentation d'aujourd'hui est de mieux comprendre la crise identitaire vécue lors de la transition à la vie civile, principalement chez les militaires qui ont été libérés en raison d'une blessure de stress opérationnel, via la présentation de résultats préliminaires du projet de recherche. Ce projet de recherche se fonde sur le sens que les acteurs donnent à leurs expériences, c'est-à-dire sur les interprétations qu'ils ont du monde dans lequel ils vivent, sur leurs aspirations et leur rapport à l'avenir, et sur la compréhension qu'ils ont de leur propre vécu. Il vise à répondre à la question suivante: Quelles sont les modalités de remaniement identitaire des militaires libérés des Forces armées canadiennes dans les suites d'une blessure de stress opérationnel? Notre hypothèse de travail est double. La force du rite d'entrée dans l'institution militaire considérée totalitaire, parce qu'elle élimine quasiment toute trace d'identité pré-militaire, conjuguée à l'absence d'un rite de sortie, contribue ensemble à la blessure identitaire des militaires et à leur difficulté de réintégration à la vie civile. Ce projet vise donc 3 objectifs. 1, documenter le rite d'institution militaire et les techniques de fabrication de l'habitus militaire dès l'entrée et pendant la trajectoire institutionnelle. 2, identifier les facteurs objectifs et subjectifs qui contribuent ensemble à la transformation identitaire des militaires tout au long de leur carrière, c'est-à-dire avant la carrière, pendant la carrière et après la carrière. Et aussi comprendre le sens donné par les acteurs à leur sortie du militaire, en lien avec leurs pratiques quotidiennes et leurs stratégies concrètes de réintégration à la vie civile. Plusieurs concepts sont mobilisés dans le cadre de cette recherche dans le but de bien cerner les rouages de l'entrée à la sortie des Forces armées canadiennes. Nous jugeons important de mettre en discussion 2 auteurs dans une perspective macro-déterministe et micro-interactionniste qui touchent les rites d'institution et la place du soi dans des contextes extrêmes, en étudiant les dispositifs et comment ils influencent les parcours de vie et le développement identitaire. Le concept d'habitus de Pierre Bourdieu sera utilisé pour analyser la construction de l'identité militaire qui prend forme dans le rite d'institution et qui doit son efficacité symbolique au fait qu'il infère l'individu, ici le soldat, des attributs identitaires et physiques, et donc l'informe de ce qu'il est et ce qu'il a à être. Par l'inculcation, l'endoctrinement, l'institutionnalisation, les soldats demeurent des soldats, même parfois l'uniforme retiré. De plus, nous utiliserons le concept de carrière morale tel que défini par Erving Goffman en le transposant au concept de carrière militaire, ce qui nous permettra de suivre sur une base individuelle les étapes de transformation de l'identité opérées à travers les rites d'institution dictés par l'institution totalitaire. Une attention particulière sera accordée au moment de la sortie de l'institution militaire et à la désincorporation de l'institution chez le militaire libéré. Le projet utilise une approche qualitative dans une perspective ethno-sociologique qui se fonde entre autres sur une enquête de terrain et des récits de vie, s'inspirant en cela de la tradition ethnographique. Ce récit de vie est en fait le narratif centré sur la trajectoire de vie et les expériences vécues. De fait, l'enquête de terrain ici nommée fut l'entretien comme situation d'observation. La cueillette des récits de vie a suivi un guide d'entretien qui s'inspire du concept de carrière, la carrière se divisant en 3 grandes périodes de la vie des militaires, soit la pré-carrière militaire, la carrière elle-même, la post-carrière militaire. Les récits de vie ont pu ainsi nous permettre de comprendre le monde social autour d'un type spécifique d'activité que nous identifions comme étant la vie militaire. À cette étape du projet, les données d'entrevue biographiques sont recueillies et nous avons procédé avec une première lecture flottante qui nous a permis de voir émerger une forme de typologie ou de récurrence. Au fil des relectures, les termes surgiront et permettront ainsi de découper les textes en catégories substantives, ce qui constitue la prochaine étape du projet. Notre échantillon a été constitué de 16 anciens militaires canadiens francophones de la province de Québec qui ont été libérés médicalement des suites d'une blessure de stress opérationnel. Notre échantillon est donc composé de 6 femmes âgées entre 35 à 48 ans qui ont servi entre 7 et 21 années, soit dans les armes de combat pour 3 personnes et 3 autres dans les métiers de soutien. Chacune ont effectué entre 0 et 5 missions à l'étranger. Du côté des hommes, 10 participants âgés entre 34 et 59 ans qui ont servi entre 13 à 25 années de service. 6 ont servi au sein des armes de combat, 4 au niveau des métiers de soutien. Chacun ont servi 1 à 5 missions à l'étranger. Les grades ont été répartis 5 caporaux, 4 caporaux-chefs, 4 sergents, 1 capitaine et 2 majors qui ont constitué l'échantillon. 100% de notre échantillon ont reçu un diagnostic de blessure de stress opérationnel qui inclut le syndrome de stress post-traumatique, dépression majeure, troubles anxieux, troubles d'adaptation et problèmes de dépendance. 63% de ceux-là de ceux-ci, vivent avec des douleurs chroniques, mais qui sont minimisées dans les discours en exprimant que ce sont des douleurs normales qui viennent avec la job. 19% ont développé des troubles auditifs, mais le fait le plus important est que 100% de l'échantillon féminin a subi des inconduites sexuelles qui ont contribué en partie ou entièrement au syndrome de stress post-traumatique. Les résultats préliminaires suite à la lecture flottante, lorsqu'on s'attarde à la pré-carrière militaire, on note une enfance marquée au fer chaud. Les participants parlent d'abus physiques, psychologiques et sexuels, d'intimidation à l'école, d'isolement, de familles dysfonctionnelles, d'abandon d'un ou des deux parents et de relations difficiles dans la fratrie. La totalité des participants parlent d'un manque de reconnaissance de leur capacité de la part d'un membre de leur famille ou de leur entourage. C'est une invisibilité qui fait mal. La presque totalité des participants évoquent avoir tenu un rôle d'adulte alors qu'ils n'étaient qu'enfants. Parents alcooliques, parents suicidaires, parents dépressifs, parents sans emploi, enfants laissés à lui-même. Le besoin de quitter une famille biologique dans l'espoir de trouver mieux ailleurs était le mot d'ordre. Le défi de joindre les forces vient avec un désir de quelque chose qui permettra de faire du sens de sa vie, de trouver sa place, de faire partie d'une famille unie et de se faire enfin reconnaître. Les participants sont fiers d'avoir réussi les différents rites de passage dans l'institution. Ils parlent d'avoir enfin réussi à appartenir à un groupe qu'ils appellent à l'unisson leur nouvelle famille. On comprend ici qu'on parle de résultats qui concernent la carrière militaire. Ils évoquent la performance avec une grande fierté, de la reconnaissance, de l'encouragement, du dépassement de soi et principalement une identité bien ancrée. Plusieurs parlent encore « j'étais sergent X »,« j'étais major un tel ». Tous relatent des faits de carrière comme étant une performance à son meilleur, même dans les situations de stress les plus intenses ou même les plus souffrantes. Pour tous les participants rencontrés, c'est une fin de carrière qui est aussi marquée au fer chaud par le diagnostic qui a conduit à la libération médicale qui n'a pas été choisie. Le sentiment de devenir invisible est réapparu à cause des congés de maladie et le tabou entourant les problèmes de santé mentale. C'est l'isolement et le retour au sentiment d'enfance de ne pas avoir de valeur au sein de la famille. L'adulte redevient enfant qui vit le rejet, l'abandon et qui perd à nouveau ses points de repère. Les participants sont unanimes, ils ont perdu une partie d'eux-mêmes en leur enlevant leur uniforme, en les dépossédant de leur appartenance et en les réduisant à un simple numéro de matricule dont on peut disposer. Un mot d'ordre, je me suis fait rejeter par ma famille. À 100%, les participants se posent la même question. Je suis qui maintenant sans mon uniforme? Donc, une hypothèse qui se confirme tranquillement. Les raisons poussant vers le choix d'une carrière militaire doublée de la force du rite d'entrée dans l'institution, conjuguée à l'absence de choix en lien avec la libération, doublée de l'absence d'un rite de sortie de l'institution, contribuent ensemble à la blessure identitaire des militaires et à leur difficulté d'intégrer la vie civile. Toutefois, n'étant que dans l'étape préliminaire de l'analyse des données, toute présomption de fait concluant ne peut être avancée. Il demeure toutefois important de mentionner que les participants ont senti que leur expérience a été reconnue et valorisée au travers de leur participation à une recherche qui aura pour effet de contribuer à une meilleure connaissance des enjeux entourant la transition à la vie civile des anciens militaires vivant avec une blessure de stress opérationnel et l'impact de cette transition sur l'identité même de ceux-ci. Cette recherche permettra aussi de mettre de l'avant la réalité des douleurs chroniques vécues par les participants, même si elle n'est apparue qu'au fil des entretiens. Elle demeure une réalité que nous devons aborder suivant le concept d'habitus et son corps guerrier tel que proposé par Bourdieu. Cette contribution est d'autant plus importante qu'elle mettra en évidence les divers obstacles rencontrés dans la transition vers la vie civile et favorisera l'avancement des connaissances susceptibles d'améliorer le processus de libération et d'intégration à la vie civile. Les Forces armées canadiennes, le ministère des Anciens combattants, les ressources communautaires et les anciens combattants eux-mêmes pourront tirer avantage de ces nouvelles connaissances acquises via ce projet de recherche. La mise au jour de ces expériences concrètes ne peut que sensibiliser les milieux aux divers obstacles rencontrés par les anciens militaires qui mettent leur savoir d'expérience à profit, ainsi qu'aux stratégies qu'ils mettent en œuvre pour tenter de se reconstruire en dehors de l'uniforme militaire. Merci.
Merci. Merci, Hélène, for that wonderful presentation. I just want to highlight one specific piece. So usually studies look at folks during their time in the military and after, but can you speak to the importance of having studied the period prior to the military career, especially when the objective is to understand the identity crisis after their transition?
Oui, en fait, l'importance d'aller étudier la portion pré-carrière militaire sort du fait, en gros, que les caractéristiques qui ont mené, en fait, à l'entrée dans la carrière militaire demeurent des caractéristiques qui viennent exacerber, en fait, la souffrance au niveau de la blessure de stress opérationnel. Donc, il faut à la fois aller identifier ces facteurs-là qui vont, à la fin, nous aider à peut-être établir de nouvelles stratégies de pouvoir intervenir auprès de ces vétérans qui vont être libérés pour des raisons médicales.
Okay. So what programs or activities can help facilitate the end of this identity crisis?
En fait, à ce jour, il n'y a pas beaucoup de programmes qui ont été établis spécifiquement en lien avec le thème de l'identité. On voit beaucoup de programmes qui vont viser du rétablissement au niveau physique, du rétablissement au niveau, ou sans dire du rétablissement, pardon, mais une transition au niveau financier. Par contre, lorsqu'on parle d'identité, à ce jour, il y a peu de programmes qui sont proposés à même la transition, donc au travers les unités de transition. À l'extérieur, au niveau communautaire, on voit qu'il y a un engouement pour ces types de programmes-là. Je pense par exemple à la Maison des champions qui, en fait, aborde la transition sous un angle, je dirais, multiple et mixte aussi, où on jumelle des anciens combattants avec des anciens athlètes de haut niveau et des gens de grandes entreprises. Donc, le fait d'aborder la transition sous un œil autre que seulement militaire, parfois va permettre justement d'entrevoir des avenues différentes. Donc, il y a un engouement en lien avec cette question identitaire, mais je pense qu'à ce jour, le bienfait de ce projet de recherche-là, justement, va peut-être pouvoir contribuer à développer des programmes qui vont, en fait, répondre à ce besoin-là ou à cette crise-là.
Thank you. There's a question from the audience that asks if you could summarize a key finding in English. They said their French is a little poor because identity work is so important. Can you please explain, let's say, identity?
So I'll try to do my best. Sorry for that. So the preliminary findings is that the reason why the person is joining the military, you will see that it's going to be at the end of the service, the same kind of issues that will exacerbate the OSI. So it's important to know, to understand what the person was looking for in joining the military. For example, finding a new family, having a sense of purpose, having a sense of not being invisible to his family. So everything that the person is looking for in the military while joining, at the end, you know, when the transition is not something that has been chosen, it has been imposed to the person, well, it's going to be the same kind of reaction the person will face. Like, for example, again, it's a rejection from the family, because people joining the military are looking at a new family. Same thing for the invisibility, because when you have or you live with an OSI, most of the time you've been tossed away because, you know, you were not able to do your job. So you've been either on sick leave and then eventually released from the military. So again, it's like you disappear from, you know, the family you were living with. So the importance of looking what has been, you know, the reason why you joined the military will indicate, you know, how we can address the transition and try to not necessarily prevent the identity crisis, but at least facilitate, you the transition, addressing those issues.
Thank you so much for answering both official languages. Really appreciate that. And of course, identity is so pivotal to our veterans and our armed forces. So really appreciate your work. And just the final question is, you did have a 16 participant group, and do you think that constitutes a significant or sufficient sample in the context of this research project?
The way I was, establishing my project, it was based on, collecting life histories, so every participant, 16 participant, well, it was 15 at the beginning, but I went for a 16th one because I needed to go further for the women's side of it. But the thing is, trying to grasp the entire life of a person, it needs more than an hour to do so. So instead of, having more people, I did focus on having the time to take, all the information related to prior the career, understand where the person is coming from, talk about the career, how the person felt, while in service, and then the transition out of the military and what's happening right now. So all for my sample, I did interviews that last for either between 3 to 4 hours. So, the data that I collected with these 16 interviews is amazing, and it's very heavy to just analyze. So I guess, and my director also told me, 15 is good enough. But like I said, I went for a 16 one to get some more information, but it's more about the quality of, the stories I went for.
Thanks so much. Yeah, the data that you collect is very rich and is high quality, and that's the importance, especially when you're looking at a trajectory of someone. So I completely agree. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Lan, for your beautiful and wonderful presentation. This is really informative, and anyone else has additional questions, please send an email to Lan or to some folks, and we'll make sure it gets to it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Our next presentation is by Dr. Dominic Murphy and is titled Understanding the Unique Needs of UK Female Veterans. Over to you.
Hello, my name is Professor Dominic Murphy, and I'm going to be talking about the needs of UK female veterans. But before we do, with the obligatory disclosure slides. So you can see here I've had funding from a variety of different organisations and sit on a variety of different boards. And all that kind of information's there. This was an interesting project because actually, whilst we received support from an organisation called the Women's Royal Army Corps in kind, helping us kind of get access to a potential set of female veterans, we didn't have any funding to do this research, which is actually, I think, quite a challenge in itself, but no other kind of conflicts of interest to declare. As you can see here, we had service user involvement in the co-design of the survey. The survey we used, quantitative survey for this, was developed using kind of evidence-based kind of research questions. And actually there's 5 main research papers that have resulted from this work. And they were all kind of a priori kind of analytic plans that have been developed. The learning objectives, well, I would hope to help that you would understand a little bit about the mental health needs of a community sample of UK female veterans. Very briefly, because we're getting more of an overview, but to think about some of the life course factors related to current mental health status, so particularly kind of a bit pre-service, during service, and after service. Okay, so here we are. I'm going to be presenting today on the needs of UK female veterans. My name's, as I said, Professor Dominic Murphy. I head up a research team at a charity in the UK called Combat Stress, which works with veterans, mainly with PTSD and trauma. I'm also based in King's College London University, and president of something called the UK Psychological Trauma Society. Right, so I'm giving a bit of an overview of our studies today, and really, this was an active collaboration between Combat Stress and an organisation called the Women's Royal Army Corps. Now, the Women's Royal Army Corps is a charity in the UK which is dedicated to supporting female veterans, particularly female veterans that may be struggling with post-transition. So it's kind of an important potential limitation. Now, what we did was in last August, October last year, we contacted everyone on their kind of database of people registered with them, which was around 1,700 individuals. We sent them email kind of invite to take part in an online survey, and we got responses from around 750 individuals. And today I'm going to talk about kind of papers from kind of 4 different, very high kind of overview from 4 different studies. One looking at the mental health profile of this cohort, one looking at some of the challenges faced during their military careers, one looking at service adversity and some of the barriers, the qualitative paper we did looking at some of the barriers to help. We're actually just starting a phase 2 based on some of the results we found. We're actually going back to subgroups to do some qualitative research to get sort of more in-depth understanding of what some of their experiences have been. Okay, so looking at mental health profile here. So the blue bar, these are our participants, and you can see the red bar, this is the wider UK veteran population, and the sort of, well, it's supposed to be white, but I'm not too sure what colour that is in reality, sort of a greeny, whitey colour. That's the UK general public. And so if we look at the first column, PTSD, so this is probable PTSD using something called the PCL5, so it's not a diagnosis, but it's probable. And all these studies, the data is from comparable studies, use the same measure. And you can see actually in this female cohort, this community samples, these aren't treatment seekers, community sample, around just over 10% were reporting symptoms suggestive of PTSD, which compares to around 7-ish% in the general military population, and around, I think it's about 4.5% in the general UK population. So actually, I was very surprised by this, really higher than we thought rates of PTSD. Similarly, we found really high rates of common mental health difficulties. So these are symptoms of anxiety and depression. Again, the blue bar, this is the one in the middle, seem to be higher in the female veteran group than in the wider military group. And in that wider military group, it's comparing, there's men and women in there, but 90% would be male. And again, higher than the general public. And then alcohol, the last one is looking at alcohol misuse on the audit, and having quite a high cutoff of 16 or above. And you can see actually that there, the female veteran group, but more similar to the general public and far lower than the wider veteran group. But what really emerged for me is actually really high rates of PTSD and pretty significantly high rates of common mental health difficulties. And there's suggestive that these are higher than you'd expect in the general veteran population. Now, next we wanted to think about, what are some of the predictors associated with these mental health difficulties. So here we did a regression analysis, logistic regression analysis, and you can see we take the first column, PTSD, childhood adversity is measured using the ACEs, highly significantly associated with meeting criteria for PTSD. What we term military adversity, which I'll talk about in a later slide, and a lot of physical symptoms. Really surprised by this very strong association, an odds of 8 between physical symptoms, physical health symptoms, and PTSD, which maybe suggests the kind of somatization of mental health distress. And there's actually some other work that suggests that actually maybe physical manifestation of symptoms this way is actually a core component of PTSD. As you may expect, relationships between PTSD and common mental health difficulties with an array of functional impairment, so feeling less social support and feeling very lonely and isolated. And of course, this is cross-sectional, so the causality can't really make much of causality here, but kind of clear evidence that actually people that struggle with these symptoms of PTSD or anxiety and depression are also far more functionally impaired. The next thing we want to think about what we term gender-specific challenges. Now these were generated for kind of a service user kind of panel, helped generate a list of about 15 potential challenges faced during military service and about I think it was 15 challenges faced after military service in transition. And we asked participants, compared to your male counterparts, did you experience these more or less, than, in your opinion? And you can see here, these are the top 4 frequently endorsed military kind of challenges faced, and the 4 most endorsed after military service, that kind of transition period. And if you look at the military ones first, I think, to me, it's kind of clear that these were all evidence of pretty institutional, or suggestive of institutional sexism here, that really badly damaged people's careers. Example, nearly 50% felt they were treated differently because of childcare responsibilities compared to their male counterparts who may also have childcare responsibilities. Over 40%, about 40% felt they had to perform at a higher level than their male colleagues just to get the same level of recognition. You looked at the sort of veteran experiences, actually talked a bit about kind of actually when they transitioned out, they felt less comfortable being around other veterans, sort of other veterans, or engaging in veteran organizations. Some of the demographics here, so these are some of the things that were associated. So the yellow highlighted boxes were associated with higher rates of reporting of these challenges compared to the blue boxes where it wasn't significant. So particularly those who had left the military and non-voluntary discharge, who had left it against their kind of wishes, far more likely to report military these sort of challenges. People who had children during the military service, again, more likely to. And then actually people that suggested maybe having a poorer transition out, not being current in employment. So some of the kind of service adversity. Now, I'm aware I'm skimming through here at a very quick level. These papers, one or two are published. A lot of them are going to be published soon. So please, I've got my email address at the end. You can always contact me if you want access to these papers as and when they come out. You can have a look when they are published. So this, I mean, the main thrust of this paper we looked at here was the experience of kind of military sexual trauma, physical assault, and emotional bullying during military service and current health status now. Firstly, you can see PTSD was associated with all of these sort of adversity, you can see that kind of jumping ahead. Coming with physical health stuff, particularly kind of sexual harassment, and alcohol misuse and lower social support with kind of, unfortunately, kind of the sexual assault. You can also, if you look at the top figures, really high prevalence rates of reporting here. So nearly over 1 in 5, 20% reported experiencing emotional bullying. 1 in 5 reported experiencing sexual harassment, and 1 in 20, so about 5%, reported experiencing sexual assault during the military career. So these are high rates, and it may well be that these are, given this is a self-report questionnaire, people may not feel comfortable to report, their experiences on the questionnaire. So this may even be an underrepresentation. So the final kind of bit of the jigsaw I'm presenting today is what we thought about barriers to help seeking. And so for those who endorsed mental health difficulties, we asked a further kind of qualitative question, which was about kind of, were there any barriers you experienced in seeking help? And you can see, if you remember my first slide, I kind of suggested we're going back and doing some further and more in-depth qualitative work, because actually, I think I'm going to present the findings now, but actually it's not quite, I think there's a lot more that needs to be explored here. But what did come out, as you can see, 5 key themes emerged from the data. And some of these are similar to what you might expect if you asked a more kind of gender mixed veteran population about barriers to seeking help. So your mental health stigma, and people feeling unfairly that they were going to be treated differently, or they actually were treated differently because of mental health experiences compared to people who weren't experiencing mental health difficulties. I think that's quite common for everyone, for both males and females. Lack of understanding from professionals. I think this is where something started to emerge about more unique challenges faced by the female cohorts. This female cohort, or the participants who answered this question, where actually they were kind of it wasn't just the mental health professionals didn't understand what their struggles were. It's that they just treated them differently based on gender, it appeared. They talked actively about some gender-related discrimination. For example, one person talked about actually being a female and a veteran wasn't recognised at their kind of national kind of their health and their surgery in their kind of work by the doctor. They also talked a lot about sort of mental health being considered, talking about veteran mental health being considered more from a male point of view than from their point of view. So again, I think, you know, those are two themes I think are very unique to females. Lack of access barriers, again, I think this is a bit more general. Actually, we see this a lot in males, also not knowing where to go for support, not being aware they're entitled to support. And then the last one, actually, around people's sexual orientation and people reporting and facing real discrimination because of their sexuality, and how actually this then got in the way of them seeking support when they were struggling themselves with mental health difficulties. And again, this is one of the areas we want to explore further, or we need to explore further, because actually this data is sort of, it's providing something, but it's not as rich as I think it could be, and I think it kind of justifies us going into more detail. So some of the conclusions. Now, I haven't really gone into some of the limitations here, but of course, with a study like this, there are limitations. You know, whilst it was a community sample, it was a sample engaged with a charity, so there may be some, you know, reasons why people engage with that. So it may not be fully representative. The sample were a little older than you might expect from a normal veteran population. I think the average age was about 60, and we often in veteran research think the average age is more kind of early 50s. So there may be some limits there. But actually, I think there's intensive evidence that the female veterans, particularly in this cohort, but the female veterans in the UK were experiencing rates of PTSD and common mental health difficulties that were particularly high, appeared to be higher than the wider veteran population, but also certainly higher than the wider UK population, particularly, you know, linked to lots of kind of impairment as well. And I think for me, what came out really strongly was this relationship between physical health needs and mental health needs, particularly around PTSD. I mean, some of the predictors pre-service, really, as you might expect, high levels of childhood adversity. During service, we had the kind of bullying, military sexual trauma, unfortunately, were kind of both prevalent and associated with most mental health status now, and a whole array of what we call gender-specific challenges or experiences of pretty awful experiences of sexism. We also unfortunately found that lots of people with mental health difficulties in this group reported significant barriers to seeking help. So for me, you know, what are the next steps? I think really thinking about how services may need to adapt to meet these specific needs of female veterans. I think also thinking about how a lot of, in the UK at least, a lot of our services, we talk about with veterans, we talk about deployment-related trauma and things like that, and actually many of the trauma experiences they reported, at least in this cohort, were more interpersonal, and so actually this is more kind of more nuanced and may need to be treated differently. Okay, so here are some of the references. I said only one of these papers has been published so far. The rest are kind of either under review or awaiting publication. And I very quickly thank the study team: Julia, Charlotte, Laura, Catherine, Tanya, and Isabel, and all the participants in the WRAC who took part. You can find out more information about us at our website there. And yeah, I hope that's helpful. And you can always feel free to drop me an email. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dominic, for that insightful presentation. I know we always talk about the importance of getting this research to the folks that will affect the most. And with that in mind, what do you think the implications of this research may have for service providers?
I think one really clear one is to help people move away from thinking only about deployment-related trauma and to think about actually all the very unfortunately insidious and unpleasant interpersonal traumas that everyone in the veteran population may experience, but it seems to be, from our research, that women are, as you would expect from the general non-veteran population, women are more likely to be at risk at. So I think that's kind of one thing. In the UK, we have a lot of veteran-specific services as well, and actually veterans coming together, being treated, And actually, that might not be appropriate for people whose traumas have been more interpersonal and military sexual traumas, going for treatment in the places with a lot of other veterans around. So actually being kind of a bit more sensitive to help people engage. So I think that they're kind of two things that jump out for me. The other one is that relationship between the physical and the mental health. And often, at least in the UK, we're quite siloed. So we'll treat the kind of the physical, the mental health in one team, and another team will treat physical health, and maybe thinking a bit more about the interrelationship between them.
Point. I think that's similar to the situation in Canada, the need for that integration between physical and mental, and that they shouldn't be treated in isolation because that can cause a lot of difficulties. So I think that is something that we need to continue to build off of. Another question is just what might be some of the limitations that need to be considered when interpreting findings?
Yeah, and I think the big one is actually some of the demographics up from the sample aren't that dissimilar to the wider demographics one would expect in a veteran population, but there were people that engaged with a charity whose main aim is around raising the profile of female veterans. And so there may be that they're not, the cohort we recruited aren't fully representative of the wider female kind of veteran population. So, there may be some biases towards a group that may have more difficulty potentially. So that's kind of one which I think is important to hold in mind. Also, we were only able, I think we did well, but we were only able to get responses from about 45%. And unfortunately, we didn't have any demographic information on the 55% we weren't able to track down. So we weren't able to do kind of statistical weighting to take into account of that. So unfortunately, things we can control for.
Well, thank you so much, Dominic. And if there's any additional questions, Dominic shared his email and his information, and we'd be happy to get those questions over to him. But thank you again, Dominic, for your presentation and for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak.
Take care. Right. And our final presentation for the day is by Dr. Stephen Grover, and it's titled Online Health Promotion for Canadian Veterans and Their Families During the Pandemic. Over to you.
Hi, I'm Stephen Grover. It's a pleasure to speak to you today on our recent study looking at online health promotion for Canadian veterans and their families during the pandemic. A couple of quick disclosure slides. It's important to note that the Mission VAB program was funded by a grant from the Veterans and Family Wellbeing Fund, and I'm a principal of Clinometrica Inc., which received the grant, and I'm also a founding director of the McGill Comprehensive Health Improvement Program, where the Mission VAB content was developed and pilot tested. All data was self-reported and collected online directly from study participants. Our learning objectives today will be to understand how an online health promotion program impacted veterans and their family members during the pandemic. And we're also going to compare the results to other Canadians who used the program at the same time. I provide some references in case you want to check out some of our work. Let's get started here. As many of you know, Canadian veterans and family members often suffer from a number of health issues compared to other Canadians, including chronic pain and a number of mental health problems. Most recently, this is a study that hasn't yet been published, a survey was done of the well-being of Canadian veterans during the COVID-19 pandemic. Importantly, 56% were feeling worse, 30% no change, and only 4% were feeling better. This sets us up for an opportunity to see if we can make a difference with an online health improvement program. Web-based programs may improve lifestyle habits if they can be proven to be engaging and effective. And unfortunately, high dropout rates are very common. This is perhaps best represented by a recent effort by U.S. Veterans Affairs, where they developed a COVID coach app. They released it in 2020. It provided 13 digital health interventions to support veterans' health. And during the first 4 months, over 49,000 individuals downloaded the app. Unfortunately, 49% used it only once, and less than 2% used the app for 15 days or more. I'm pleased to say our colleagues in the United States published their experience, and this information is very helpful in those of us who are trying to improve health through the digital health space. Social isolation measures associated with the pandemic negatively impacted the health and lifestyle habits of Canadians, including stress, sleep quality, healthy eating, weight management, and physical activity. An online health promotion program that had been started in late 1990 preceded the pandemic, and we opened it to all Canadians during the pandemic in March 2020. This provided us with an opportunity to compare the results of other Canadians to the veterans and their families. This program was developed to help veterans and their families adopt healthy lifestyle habits, connect with peers, and have fun participating in online health missions. We evaluated the impact of sequential 6 to 10 week missions on self-reported metrics, including stress, sleep quality, fatigue, mastery, loneliness, daily exercise, and weight loss. During the 12 pandemic months, starting in March of 2020, regular missions were provided to registered users, including 3 homebound resiliency missions, 1 Buns of Steel mission to build up muscle strength, a family summer fitness program last summer, a healthy heart mission during Healthy Heart Week, 2 Drop 5 weight loss missions to help people lose weight, plus a Pirates and Privateers exercise challenge, which just provided a lot of fun around Stan Rogers' song, Barrett's Privateers. And then this past summer, a Push Past the Pandemic mission to get older individuals involved in recovering from the pandemic, a Zen mental health mission, and most recently now we have an online Eat Well mission that's occurring as we speak. The program design focuses primarily on gamification and social connectivity, and these are used to drive participant engagement. These include health assessments at baseline and at the mission completion, behavior tracking, leaderboards, daily health tips, and a message board. So you can see here how someone could be tracking their mood, stress, resilience, sleep. They could be comparing how their team is doing to other teams. They're getting a tip of the day. They're making note of what they're doing each and every day. And last but not least, they're posting information to their team wall, the mission wall itself, or a wisdom wall where they share reflections on what's worked best for them. Daily exercise was digitally tracked and are self-reported. They could do this with their smartphone or a digital tracking device. Weight was tracked weekly, and mental health metrics were assessed using validated tools such as the Perceived Stress Score, the Insomnia Severity Index, etc. Here you see an example how they can enter steps manually, or it can be tracking on their Apple device in this particular case. Steps, calories, minutes of exercise are being tracked. And if you're watching your weight, week by week, they're tracking their weight as an example. Let me show you the results of the first 434 participants. The average age was 49. 64% were female. Half were veterans, family members, and supporters. The other half were non-veterans. Nearly 60% participated on a team. The rest participated individually. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about health coaching in a minute. 50% received health coaching at some point during their mission. 25% included their dog on a pet leaderboard, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And 64% completed at least one mission. 27% dropped out on average during any one mission within 2 weeks. Excuse me, and that's a pretty favorable dropout rate. Most online programs see at least 30 to 50% dropout within the first week or two. Many don't get past 30% completion rate. At the end of 6 to 10 weeks, depending on what they were doing, this is the data for 327 individuals. 44% exercised the equivalent of 10,000 steps or more a day. That's the equivalent of walking about 5 miles daily. Among those who were in the Drop 5 mission and trying to lose weight, 40% lost at least 5 pounds over 10 weeks. Stress levels improved by at least 20% in 53% of participants, and sleep quality improved by at least 20% in another 49% of participants. If we compare veterans and their family members to other participants, you can see the results are very similar. Approximately the same age, 2/3 to 80% were female. On average, our participants were overweight or obese. Insomnia severity scores were elevated, as was perceived stress scores, as was general fatigue, and the completion rates were about the same. About 64 to 68% got through 4 weeks in the mission. Drop in stress was 14 to 19%. Improvements in sleep, 9% for the veterans and family members. Sleep actually got worse in the other group by 3%. Drops in fatigue of 12 to 13%, and on average, people were exercising approximately 11,000 steps a day, which is incredible. One of the things we've learned in this particular mission was tracking really supports behavior change. This has been proven by others, but we also have found that if you want to change something, track how you're doing. And that can be measuring your weight once a week, or tracking your exercise daily, or looking at what your sleep hygiene habits are every night that you go to bed. And making it easy was a very important part of the tracking exercise. Engagement supported using mastery, social connectivity, and gamification, very, very important. Here's the PET leaderboard, which we introduced about midway through. In our most recent mission of just over 400 people, we actually had 149 pet users who posted their pets up on the leaderboard. That included 141 dogs, 3 cats, and somebody posted a guinea pig as well, but I can't understand how the guinea pig exercised on a daily basis. Health coaching also made a difference. During the pandemic, we reached out to volunteer students, both psychology students and medical students. And we taught them how to become health coaches by monitoring online activity of the participants and once a week sending them an email to reflect back on what they were doing, how they were reaching their goals, and of course, picking up on anyone who looked like they were dropping out. Early dropouts declined significantly from 9% to 7% with health coaching, while participants remained in the mission 36% longer, an average of 49 versus 36 days. Daily exercise also increased by an additional 20%. Despite the restrictions imposed by the pandemic, an online health promotion program developed for veterans and their families was associated with improvements in lifestyle habits, measurable health benefits, and building community. For us, the remaining challenge for the next 2 years is how do we scale this up and reach those veterans and family members who would benefit the most from engaging with their colleagues while improving their healthy lifestyle habits. While we saw lots of improvement in mental health metrics, exercise habits, and weight loss, it's clear to us that our participants do not represent those who have the greatest problems in the veteran community. 60 individuals did have mobility problems, and some were wheelchair bound, and I think that's great that we were able to reach those individuals. But one of the things we're looking for in the next 2 years is going to be how do we get to the veterans that can benefit the most? And that will include individuals with chronic pain, mobility issues, those who are using medical cannabis to treat unmet medical needs. All right, this will be an interesting journey. We look forward to collaborating with any of you who are interested in this project, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for the wonderful presentation. I know there was a lot that you touched on, but there's a 2-part question. The first is, what are the biggest challenges you've faced developing this online health promotion program for veterans and their families? And do you have any advice for other groups trying to reach out to veterans?
Yeah, those are good questions. The biggest challenge, if you think about how many veterans there are out there, between 600 and 700,000 veterans plus family members, the potential reach is huge. And when you look at the fact that to date, after 2 years, we've got about 1,500 participants, I'm not terribly impressed. We're driving ourselves crazy here trying to figure out ways to reach more veterans. I have to tell you that social media has not been terribly helpful. Sometimes paying for a press release or media attention can be useful, but we're very limited budget-wise on how far we can get there. We're trying to grow organically, and most recently, it's not included in that data, but most recently, we're starting to encourage those who want to participate. Building teams is important, and we're encouraging those who want to participate that the next challenge is going to require that you bring in new people into the thing. So growing it organically with veterans reaching out to other veterans looks like we're getting somewhere, but it's really slow. And it's sometimes you get really discouraged, and then you see the results or you get feedback from individuals and you think, well, we're doing good here for, at least a couple of thousand people, but the potential is so much greater.
Yeah, unfortunately, with social media not getting out there as much as we'd like, I think leveraging partnerships might be another good way of getting this information out, and hopefully folks who are listening in on the session can help promote and support the project. Now, what health and lifestyle issues do you think have had the biggest impact on so far?
Our experience with veterans is pretty similar to other projects, either in the workplace or with academics or medical students. That tends to be that we can typically get people exercising pretty easily. Exercise, as you know, is the low-hanging fruit in Canadian culture because the vast majority of Canadians are doing virtually nothing. And we know that healthcare benefits associated with regular exercise are just huge, both on the physical and the mental health side. So we can do pretty well on the exercise. I'm impressed that we've found consistently we can make a difference on things like sleep quality, stress. We see typically very good results on depression for those individuals who have evidence of depression. In fact, a paper just got published this past week by some of my colleagues working in this area with this type of platform. So we're very excited by the mental health side of it. I'm going to be we have new funding now to look at a project around medical cannabis use among Canadian veterans and see to what extent can we offer them other alternatives to medical cannabis use or ways to enhance their medical cannabis use by including lifestyle changes that have a positive impact on chronic pain, mental health issues, those sorts of things. So that will be another challenge in the coming year. I think the possibilities are huge. So far, we've got good signals on exercise, weight loss for those individuals who are trying to lose weight. We've been very pleased with the weight loss data, and mental health issues.
Wonderful, thank you. We've heard a lot today about the importance of physical and mental health and how we can't be treating them in isolation. So I think this just highlights that importance as well, and we'll be looking forward to your future study on cannabis use with the veteran population. Wonderful, thank you, Stephen, and thank you for joining us and for that wonderful presentation. Awesome, well, I think time to close our session. Again, I want to thank our wonderful presenters for sharing their expertise and knowledge. We are incredibly appreciative of the time and expertise that they've offered us all on this very important topic of veteran mental health and well-being. I'd like to now pass it to Dr. Dave Pedler to deliver closing remarks. Over to you.
So this brings CIMVHR Virtual Forum 2021 to an end. I hope all of you enjoyed the past 5 weeks of military, veteran, public safety personnel, and family health research presented in our 6 sessions. I encourage all of you to continue connecting and collaborating with colleagues from across the country and around the world. All of us working together is how we will truly advance research that will benefit those who are serving, have served, and their families. This year's forum would not have been possible without our sponsors. Thanks to their commitment to our military, veterans, public safety personnel, and their families, the forum was free of charge for all participants. To our platinum sponsors, Edgewood Health Network, True Patriot Love Foundation, and the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, thank you. To our gold sponsors, Sunshine Coast Health Network, Canadian Cannabis Clinics, and the Journal of Military, Veteran, and Family Health, which I encourage all of you to submit your papers to, thank you. We are beyond grateful for your support. A reminder to all that you have until November 5th to connect with these dedicated organizations on the virtual platform and watch past sessions to receive your continuing professional development credits. Mr. Fardas Hosseini and Dr. Nicholas Carlton, thanks for wrapping up Virtual Forum with your professionalism and knowledge. All of us at CIMVHR appreciate your support. To all students and postdoctoral candidates, our Student and Postdoctoral Engagement Committee will be hosting a social event this evening from 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The registration link can be found in the spec booth. Finally, to the researchers who presented today, thank you for the time and effort in developing your presentations. I look forward to seeing the next steps of your research in the future. With that, I will say goodbye for now, and we'll really hope to see all of you in person for Forum 2022 in Halifax, Nova Scotia on October 17th to 19th. The forum website will have 2022 details posted early in the new year. So for now, to you and your families, stay safe and be well. Thank you again.